Hello and welcome to the next day of our Indigenous Peoples celebration here with the Charlotte Museum of History and the Catawba Indian Nation. We are so excited to spend today talking about something very near and dear to our hearts, both history, culture, and kind of the revival of those different sorts of cultures here. So today is an informal conversation. We're just going to sort of talk back and forth about some of these important aspects of culture and history here. And we want to hear from you. So if you have a question, please be sure to drop it in the chat. We definitely want to take a look at those. And we're just going to kind of get started here. So I am actually sitting here with Roo, who is a consultant for the Catawba Cultural Center. So my very first question is actually, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Tanake, Niat Lesson George-Warren, Niat Nitem Roo, Ye Isware, Ye Catawba, Ye Camping Sawacha, Tatewana Buck George, Yaksuna Hatuye, Dr. Winona Hay, Yaksuna Wanda George-Warren, Hawo Charlotte Museum of History, Hawo Manu, Hawo Hupke, Hawo Yup, Hawo Hinu, Hawo Nukti. Hi everyone, my name is Roo. I'm a citizen of Catawba Indian Nation. I'm a consultant for the tribe. I work on a lot of different things, including language revitalization, food sovereignty, and more recently helping to coordinate some services for COVID-19 response. Because I work on the language, I use every opportunity to bring the language, speak the language into the world. And so I did one of our ways of doing a traditional introduction, which is talking about who your family is, because tribes are essentially just large kinship networks, right? And so I told you about my tribal family, and I told you a little bit about what I do. I describe my work in Catawba as Yankampi Sawacha. It's a word that means both kind of artist and teacher, because if you are a potter, right, like someone who's done pottery, you're also de facto going to be a pottery teacher. And so I do a lot of education, public education, speaking events, teaching classes for schools and other groups about Catawbas and our history. But then I also do a lot of artwork as well, in basketry and then other forms. Yes, that's just a little bit, about me.
Well, and it's so exciting to hear this language being revived and to know that it's this living, breathing culture. When we revive traditions, in many ways, it's kind of like experimental archaeology. It's giving us a 21st century window into the past and telling us about the people who lived and why they did the things that they did. But part of what's so interesting about the revival is also that it is this kind of place for innovation. It's a chance for us to try to experiment, to learn. So walk me through how one goes about reviving a tradition. What do you have to do?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you once we figure it out, right? But yeah, it's an ongoing, innovative process. It's figuring out like, what are the tools at hand? How do we get it to people? So there's one level where it's just infrastructure. So we have a language app online where people can go, anyone who wants to, can go and learn some of the Catawba language, hear the words pronounced, see the meanings, and play some games and things like that. That's because we have a lot of tribal citizens who are spread out. We have a lot of citizens here in the Piedmont area, but we also have citizens out west in Colorado and Utah, as well as around the world. So we need to make sure that they also have access to their language. But then it's also about making partnerships, particularly with our other tribal entities. So like our Head Start program, our child care programs, our various, just different entities that are interacting with the public. So that's the infrastructure level. But the part that is really interesting to me is this creative aspect of it, right? Like our last person who was raised in the language passed away in 1961. And so there was this big rupture. And so we are lucky in some ways because we have a lot of recordings and writings about our language. But it's really hard to go from, basically a dictionary to a spoken language, right? We have these records, but they're spread out from the 1700s all the way through the early 1900s. And so imagine like having to reconstruct English from records from the 1700s, around the time George Washington was alive, the 1800s when Abraham Lincoln was alive, and then the early 1900s when FDR was alive. You know, it's like very difficult to weave those things back together into a language.
I know one of the questions that I get asked a lot of times is, so what did they sound like in the 18th century? And the simple answer is, we don't know.
Right.
We have some guesses. We can kind of extrapolate from current data of how the languages evolved, what accents sounded like, but it's really tough. And I just think back to my own graduate work. One of the languages that I study is French, and I can only imagine trying to piece together what French sounds like from the way it's written. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? How did you know how some of these words are pronounced?
Yeah, so we've been lucky to work with a lot of great linguists over the years. There's also been a history of linguists before that did not work with us but studied us, and we have less great relationships with them and the work that they produced. But the things that these linguists and anthropologists did was they would listen to Catawba speaking, and then they would notate it down on paper. Now, the problem is that they all use different notation systems. So one of our linguists, several of our linguists in the 1990s, because we asked our tribe, what's really important to you? And almost everyone ranked language as being really important to them. So we started partnering with these linguists to work on the project. And one of the first things the linguists asked us was, how do you want to write Catawba? Because there's no system for it. In the past, no Catawba has ever written Catawba before. So we get to decide what our written language looks like. And so we went with one that looks kind of like English, but there's characters in it that you would not recognize if you speak English. Yeah, and so it's the way that they annotated it that tells us how it was pronounced. But then there's like weird discrepancies, like for example, the word for corn, kus. One anthropologist from like the 1800s wrote it as K-U-S. And then I think 40 years later or 40 years before, another anthropologist wrote it as G-U-S. And so part of it is deciding, are those actually different pronunciations of the word? Or did the anthropologists just hear the same sound in different ways, right? Like kus, kus, like is it the same sound or is it not? So yeah, it's an interesting, I guess, like you said, experimental archaeology project.
Well, and especially in history, when we're kind of looking at accounts, you have to read so many of them to get an idea about what the truth is. And even then, you probably won't ever know the exact truth because everyone kind of has their own opinion that's invested into those projects. So it's definitely interesting to try to piece anything back together. And I can only imagine the work that goes into piecing the language back together. And I'm going to ask a tough question I don't know if you know the answer to, but I know in a lot of places, some of the language is preserved in words that were borrowed or shared. So for instance, the Powhatan language, we know that the word raccoon is actually from the Powhatan language. The English did not have a word for it when they arrived. Have we seen any of this with the Catawba language? Did you have anything like that to work with, or we don't know?
Yeah, so we have the one that comes to my mind. I know there's a couple, but the one that comes to my mind is this plant, and nowadays we don't know it as well, but during the 1800s and 1900s, it was very, very popular. It's called Yopon, and it was the only plant native to North America that produces caffeine. And in fact, to this day, you can still find Yopon plants in people's yards. It's a decorative tree. But that word comes from Catawba, which is, it means like small bush or small leaf. And so that just like tickled me when I learned that was like a Catawba word. And then of course, Catawba River, right, is obviously coming from us. But unfortunately, there's not enough like borrowed words to be able to reconstruct anything. But it is a good example of how all languages change and adapt and adopt over time, right? And I just want to mention this because I think sometimes people have this idea that tribes and tribal languages have to be as they were in 1491 to still be authentic. And the thing is, all people change, right? Like, we are not speaking like Shakespeare spoke, right? It would be very strange if we did that. And so Catawba is the same, right? The person speaking Catawba was, they did not speak the same way in the 1700s as they did in the 1800s and they did in the 1900s. But even more importantly than that, Catawba is a language that is made up of a ton of different dialects that came together in the early 1700s. After Spanish explorers came through, a lot of the large cities that Catawbas were living in and other southeastern people were living in, they started to break apart into smaller villages. And so from there, dialects started to diverge, even though they were somewhat similar to each other. But then in the 1700s, all of these villages started collapsing back in on each other as our territory was becoming smaller and smaller. And so at one point, one of the explorers in the early 1700s, whose name is escaping me at the moment, but he noted that there were at least 12 different dialects being spoken in one town. And so imagine like the amount of innovation and change that language is going through at that moment, with all of these different ideas swarming around it. So that's also another complicating factor of it, is that you have this giant moment of change in the early 1700s.
Absolutely. And I think you're talking about John Lawson.
Yes.
And John Lawson runs through this entire area. He is one of those gifts to historians in the 21st century because he was a naturalist. He wanted to describe what the world looked like, and he also wanted to describe the people that he encountered. And so his descriptions are some of the best that we have of what life was like here in the Carolina Piedmont in the early 18th century. And he talks about just how many people there are and how many different cultures and how many different dialects. I mean, the best way that I'm able to think about it is you're in Rock Hill, I'm in Charlotte, we're speaking the same language, we have a very similar kind of experience here. But if you talk to someone in Charlotte, that sometimes they'll use different phrases, different idiomatic expressions than someone who does in Rock Hill, and yet we're able to communicate with each other very, very effectively. So it's not exactly, it's not an old concept, this idea of having different dialects in a certain space. But you brought up some interesting things talking about just this kind of incredible change that happens in the early 18th century. You see, especially one of the things that people forget about is that there are these very large urban centers, these very large cities. There are lots of different peoples. And then you have this influx of new people. Some of them are, of course, choosing to come here. Some of them are not. And you have this melding of culture that's happening in this area. And a lot of the ways that we as historians can see that really on the ground and see the effects of that is in foodways, historic foodways. So I know that you've been involved in a number of different projects over the years in historic foodways. Can you tell us just a little bit about what you've uncovered?
Yeah, well, I think one of the ways that I got into foodways was through the language, because we don't have a word, there was no Catawba word for computer or television, things that we think of as like essential words nowadays. But we have so many words for plants and animals and roots and leaves and things like that. And, that is because our relationship with the other things that live around us have always been really, really important to us, right? Like, I say this not as, I think sometimes people want to say like, oh, we have this like deep spiritual connection to nature. And it's true, like I am moved deeply by being able to live on the land that my ancestors have lived on for 6,000 years. But it's just way more practical than that, right? It's just the recognition that we literally rely on the planet to sustain us, right? I can't make oxygen, but I need it. I can't make water, but I need it. And so, I think that is kind of the central idea that was shifted from when Catawbas were primarily in control of the landscapes around here and other southeastern tribes. And nowadays is this shift away from the understanding that the well-being of the rest of the landscape is non-negotiable. Other ways that it's changed is most tribes and Catawbas specifically used landscape-wide management practices as their primary way of producing food. And that was primarily through rotating burn practices, so setting fires to different areas. And that would create a new kind of landscape that was even more productive, right? And so that is, we were like, how do we have animal meat? In Europe and a lot of the rest of the world, the decision was like, let's put them in pens, let's feed them, let's raise them. For Catawbas and other native people, it was like, well, why don't we just like make a landscape that has a ton of deer on it, and then it's really easy for us to go out and get them, right? And so early explorers over and over again say of Catawba lands and other lands that they were like a Garden of Eden, right? As you were reading these historical texts, you probably wandered upon that phrase a few times. It was like a Garden of Eden. Other people noting, like along the Mississippi River, that there were so many blackbirds in the sky that you couldn't even see the sun. People going farther out west seeing giant herd of bison that they couldn't even see the end of because there were so many of them. And so that is the big shift from managing the landscape, not as a piece of property, but as something, for the most part, that is shared between individuals, but also communities. So a lot of the Carolinas were shared areas between tribes in which you would even see collaboration around controlled burns, right? So those are a few of the things that shifted kind of dramatically. But the last thing I want to tell you about is I think a lesson that we learn from nature, which is hospitality, right? These plants and these animals give of themselves to keep us alive. And so we in turn must be hospitable to other people. And this was such a strong idea in the Southeast. Lawson writes about it. He writes about how you can just go into people's homes and take food. And so for Catawbas and Southeastern tribes, it was like you had to be hospitable. Not like it's a good thing to be hospitable, but like you must be hospitable. If someone wants food, you must give it to them. And this was something that Chief Hagler, who was one of our most edified chiefs in history, one of our most edified leaders, when he goes and speaks to leaders in North Carolina and South Carolina, over and over again, he repeats the same concern, which is when my warriors and my people are on trips and they're hungry and they come to your houses, you do not feed them, and sometimes you attack them. And so he was really concerned that there was this change in culture in the Southeast from hospitality to something else.
And we see that being written about in a lot of the letters at the time. Particularly, I've been exploring recently some of the letters of George Washington during the French and Indian War. And one of the things that he and his fellow writers are writing about back and forth is this difference in perception of the land, difference in perception of hospitality, all these different pieces. And you do see King Hagler going to these places. We're lucky Chaz Fagan, an artist here in Charlotte, was kind enough to lend the museum the resin mold of the statue that he created. So it's on our website, anyone can see it, and you can take a look at that particular exhibit. And it's just, when you look at him, it's a powerful moment to really kind of see someone's interpretation of this incredible figure. And we're lucky as historians that we do have a lot of kind of writings and things like that, but especially with the Catawba, we're seeing it through a very specific lens. We're seeing it through the eyes of Europeans and early Americans who are writing about this. Why is that? Why are we seeing it mostly through that perspective?
Well, because there's really been nothing written about Catawbas by Catawbas, right? And so authorship is really important. And for tribes, we've been living in a situation where we haven't had the ability to represent ourselves in popular culture. That has shifted really dramatically, I think, with the social media generation. I think young Native people are doing an amazing job of leveraging social media for education. But this has been a concern for a long time. In President Taft's during his term, there were two representatives from, I believe, Cheyenne and Arapaho nations who came to Washington, D.C. And while they were there, they went to see a movie in Washington, D.C. And this was the time of the Hollywood Western. Everything was basically a Hollywood Western. And it was some terrible movie about this Native woman who kills this settler's wife so that he will marry her. And they were just like aghast at this representation, so much so that they went to Taft and asked him if he would shut the theater down because they were so upset by this representation. And so we've known for a long time that the media is really powerful in telling stories, right? Because we are storytellers. We know that the stories we tell shape the world. And so one of the problems is that there have been a lot of half-truths and misunderstandings that have been perpetuated through media for a long time. And so, for example, this hunter-gatherer idea, this is an idea that you see pop up constantly. People are very comfortable with describing tribes as hunter-gatherers. And I really hate the phrase because it has this implication that we were like wandering through the woods and we're like, oh my gosh, a blueberry. Like, but in reality, we were managing these landscapes. We knew where the blueberries were. We knew where the deer liked to hang out. We knew how to catch a squirrel, where the best places to get the fish were, right? Just because we didn't have everything in rows didn't mean that we weren't actively involved in the production of those different animals, plants, and resources. So I think that this long legacy of not being able to represent ourselves has really impeded our imaginations about what is possible in terms of societies. I think one example of this is in terms of gender relationships. I see a lot of the time people saying that, that women have more rights now than they've ever had before in history. There's a Dolly Parton song, 19th Amendment, and she basically says, like, we finally have rights, like, for the first time in history. And the thing is that has not been true for Catawbas, right? Like, Catawba women had incredible power and prestige and were honored in society and could not be forced into marriage, like could divorce someone if they wanted to. Like, things that took a long time for the United States to get to. And so I think it's so important to like really listen to Native people about our view of our history, because it opens up so much possibility about how we can treat each other and how we can organize ourselves as a community.
No, definitely. We've seen such a shift in the last couple of years. And I mean, obviously we have a lot more work to do. There's a lot more work to do about elevating voices, understanding who we are, our narratives, anything like that. But I think especially you hit the nail on the head in this age of information, greater access to conversations. You're able to kind of expand the view of history, and there's been a real sort of push to make sure that everyone's voices are represented. And part of that, when it comes to Native American voices, is looking at what those sources are. So the Catawba you mentioned did not have a written language. Things are passed down. It's an oral tradition, but that doesn't make it any less valid. So it's a chance for people to kind of tell that story, to incorporate those pieces. And I know there's been some storytelling efforts. I've heard a couple of them. One of mine, my favorites to tell, is the story of the turtle and the kind of birth of the Catawba River itself and all the waters of the world. There are these pieces here that help you understand how people saw the world and these stories. And I know on our Saturday presentation, Stephen Criswell, the director of the Native American Studies Center, is going to go into that a little bit more. And I know you have a conversation coming up next week as a part of one of their presentations, which I'm really excited about. And I don't want to give too much away, but I have to ask about the pawpaw, which is one of my favorite fruits. I finally tried it last year. So tell me a little bit about that. Don't give everything away, just tell me a little bit.
Yeah, the pawpaw. Delicious. So good. If you've never had the chance to try it, it tastes like mango, and to me, mango and banana and apple kind of. And it's very custardy. But this is the largest fruit native to North America, spread all over the coast on the east coast. President George Washington loved them. So did Jefferson. They planted lots of pawpaws, but they just haven't been popular because it's really hard to transport them. They go bad really quickly. And so they're spread out all over the East Coast, and we are planting them whenever we get chances with the hope of being able to have some pawpaw in the near future.
Mhm. We have a couple of pawpaw trees on the museum property, and last year we had this massive haul. It was awesome. We had so many of them, and then this year we got one. And I was planning on making a pawpaw pie as one of our digital programs, and I was very depressed that we only had one, and I didn't even get to eat it because I wasn't at the museum the day it fell. But they are these really incredible fruits, and they are an interesting kind of story of not only land management, but also kind of revitalization of crops, different things that are coming back, and the transfer of knowledge between different groups of people. So I'm really excited about to learn more next week, and we'll make sure we put the link to that presentation down so everyone can sign up down in the comments for this video. But I just kind of want to give you actually the last word here as we sort of wrap up this conversation. We've talked about a lot of different things here. We've talked about a lot about revitalizing traditions. What does that look like? What kinds of traditions can you revitalize? What are the challenges? What are some of the incredible payoffs for it? So I'm going to ask you probably the hardest question you're ever going to be asked, and that's, what's your favorite? What's your favorite that you've revitalized?
Oh gosh. Well, we're definitely still in process on all of them, right? And all of these are systems, so there'll be things that we work on forever. Like, this is the work of many generations. I think, gosh, the thing that I want to talk about.
Well, like asking you to pick your favorite child, I know.
Yeah, I know. It's all connected, right? It's all, like I said, with language, there's specific words for specific plants, but if it's not a plant that we're interacting with, then there's no reason to have that word. And so we have to revitalize the words as we are revitalizing our relationship with the plants. I believe you had Cassidy do some pine needle baskets. And so that's another example, is as we were moved away from the sandhills and couldn't access our long needle pines as easily, our basket traditions started to go away that used them. And so we are looking at how we can revitalize that relationship while revitalizing this basketry tradition. But I think the big thing I would love for people to take away from this is that all people are gifted with tradition. Tradition is just another word for knowledge, knowing how to do things. And so, we all have traditions, right? Like, a lot of us celebrate Christmas, New Year's, and 4th of July, and we know how to celebrate those things because of what's been passed to us. We also have been passed how families operate, how we treat each other, right? So everyone's being passed knowledge from previous generations, and everyone has to decide what to use from that knowledge base and how to use it to move forward. And Catawbas are no different. We are just like everyone else. We're figuring out how do we take our traditions and use them to help us move forward in the present day. It's just that we have a tradition that stretches back 6,000 years on this land. And so it's just fundamentally, it's a lot different than sometimes other perspectives have been on Catawbas and on our traditions. So yeah, that's what I hope people come away with.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. Thank you for sharing what you all have done, what you are still in the process of learning. I know that we've been sharing the Catawba Cultural Center's website in all of these presentations, so please be sure to go check that out. You can actually see some of the pine needle baskets, and there's a bunch of different other things to take a look at there. We do have 2 more programs that are still coming up in the Indigenous Peoples Week celebration. Tomorrow we're going to be joined by Chief Bill Harris and Elizabeth Harris to learn more about Catawba pottery, something that is incredibly important to Catawba traditions, and we are so excited to get a chance to really kind of see that in motion and learn more. There is also a presentation, as I mentioned earlier, by Stephen Criswell of the Native American Studies Center that will be happening on Saturday. So we hope you will continue to stay involved with us, continue to share, continue to learn. If you have any questions, we are always excited to answer them. We'll put a couple of these links in the comments of this video so you guys can take a look at those. But thank you so much for spending this last half hour talking with us. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to seeing some more.
I will.